All right, it shows that it's working. We're going to get started with our Bible class. We're in Mark chapter 10. We're in the last half of the chapter, so we're going to be looking at verses 32 through 52. Mark 10, 32 through 52. And so we're going to be covering 3 points tonight. Number one, Jesus predicts for a third time His death and His resurrection. So this will be the third time that Jesus predicts His death and resurrection. That's verses 32 through 34. Secondly, we're going to look at Jesus teaching His disciples about true service. And then finally, blind Bartimaeus serves as an illustration of true discipleship. So these are lessons that are reaching a climax here in Mark's literary purpose in this particular chapter. The purpose of showing what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, to be a servant of others in order to follow Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. This is the entire scheme. So if you see the board behind me, this is real important, I think, if you wanted to see the structure of Mark, especially this section that's coming to an end right here with the last half of chapter 10. That section actually began as early as chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. If you look back there at that, you have the healing of a blind man. And chapter 8, verses 22 through 26 is a passage where Jesus heals in two stages. So I have here, it's a twofold healing of a blind man. So this is going to serve as the first bookend. And then the last bookend, the other side of this section, is going to be another healing of a blind man, blind Bartimaeus, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And this will bring this section to a close. That's basically chapters 8, 9, and 10. And so I want to see how this unfolds, and it's real good for you to see this outline, and you will get Mark's literary point pretty clearly, I think. This twofold healing of a blind man is a very unique miracle. If you notice in verse 22, it says, He came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Him and begged Him to touch him. So He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when He had spit on his eyes and put His hands on him, He asked him if he saw anything. And it says, He looked up and said, I see men like trees walking around. Now that's a pretty strange healing if you ask me, because the man is not quite fully healed, is he? Jesus touched him once, and he saw, his eyes were able to take in the light and produce, signals on the optic nerve and so forth. He saw light and he saw things, but he wasn't able to understand what it was he saw. It says, I see men like trees walking around. He couldn't put it all together. And so Jesus, it says, put His hands on him again. Verse 25, and made him look up, and he was restored, and he saw everyone clearly. So it's a twofold healing because it's going to illustrate for us what's going on spiritually with the disciples of Jesus. Because this leads us now right into the main thesis, I think, of the entire section of chapters 8, 9, and 10. And that is the confession that Jesus is the Christ. Verse 27 says, Now when Jesus and His disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road He asked His disciples, saying to them, Who do men say that I am? Well, they answered, John the Baptist, and some say Elijah, and others say you're one of the prophets. But He said to them, Who do you say that I am? Now that's been the question for the first half of the book of Mark. Who is this? Who is this man who's bringing us these new doctrines? What man can claim to forgive sins? What does this mean? Over and over you have that question. Well, now we've reached the apex of that question. Jesus poses it to His disciples right here, and Peter actually gets the right answer. There were wrong answers everywhere, but it says in verse 29 that Peter said to 28, Peter answered and said, verse 29, Peter answered and said, You are the Christ. That's the right answer. Now the problem, of course, like the man who was only partially healed, Peter got the words right, but he didn't understand what that meant. He didn't understand what it meant for Jesus to be the Christ. And secondly, he didn't understand what it meant to be a follower of Christ, to be a disciple of Christ. And that's what the entire section is going to show us in very vivid terms. And so Mark is a master at this literary tactic where he illustrates the blindness of the disciples. Even though they finally got the answer right, they were touched in one way, like Jesus' first touch on the blind man. They saw things. They could see that he was the Christ, but they didn't understand what it meant. So this is emphasized throughout. So here in chapter 8, 27 through 30 is the key text that sets the stage for the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10. And these chapters 8, 9, and 10 are structured around a threefold prediction of what it means for Jesus to be the Christ. It is a threefold prediction of his death, of his suffering, of his rejection. And it follows right on the heels here. Now what you have is chapter 8, 31 through 33 is the first time Jesus predicts his death. The second time is chapter 9, 30 through 32. And the third time is chapter 10, 32 through 33. And so Jesus predicts it. Look at verse 31 of chapter 8. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this word openly. This is the first time he starts explaining to them the implications of him being Messiah, him being Christ. It's going to mean his rejection and his death ultimately. But you notice that Mark immediately moves to show that the disciples didn't understand. Verse 32, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter is saying, this can't happen to the Messiah. This is not what I have in mind for what it means for you to be Messiah, the Christ. And so it then brings about a teaching section following the prediction and the misunderstanding of the disciples in each of these cases. It follows with a teaching section. Verses 34 through 38 in chapter 8, Jesus called the people to himself with his disciples also, and he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now that's the key. Throughout the rest of this section, Jesus is explaining what it means for him to be the Christ and them to be his followers. You've got to take up your cross. It's not about grandeur. It's not about popularity and power in the kingdom. It's about following Jesus on the road to the cross. And that's the key. That's what you have in all of these. So chapter 9, verses 30 through 32 is the second prediction. And you'll see that it follows much the same structure where Jesus makes the prediction. In verse 31, he taught his disciples and said to them, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day. But they did not understand this saying, and they were afraid to ask him. And so they didn't understand the saying, and it leads to the teaching section. It leads to the teaching about what it means to be a follower of the Christ. In verse 33, it says, he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, saying, what was it that you disputed among yourselves on the road? But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be greatest. So he had to set them down, verse 35. He called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. He even takes a child in order to illustrate this principle. Again, the same basic idea. Jesus predicts, the disciples don't understand, it leads to a teaching element. So in our text today, you have chapter 10, 32 through 34, where Jesus a third time predicts his death and resurrection. When they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. And he took the 12 aside again, and he began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Do they understand? Do they finally get it a third time? Verse 35 through 37, evidently not. James and John come saying, we want you to do something for us. He asked, what is it? They said, we want to sit in the most prominent, highest, and most popular and powerful positions in your kingdom. One on the right hand and the other on the left. Jesus says, you don't understand. So this is the key through this whole section of Mark chapters 8, 9, and 10. And it's reaching an apex here in these particular passages. And that leads us to really our second point, how we see a crescendo here in the text that we're studying tonight in the last half of chapter 10. There is an apex in the drama as it unfolds. Will the disciples ever get it? Do the disciples understand? After 3 times, they still seem to be clueless. And so let's notice some of these ways that Mark shows a great dramatic crescendo. Number 1, in Jesus' own words now, the 3rd time, he elevates the prediction to explain that he is going to suffer the most ignoble death, the most humiliating and degrading death known to man, the crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. If you'll notice, the first 2 times he predicted it, he didn't talk about Romans or crucifixion along those lines. He simply talked about being rejected by the chief priests and Pharisees, or the scribes, and so it was among the Jewish leadership he would be rejected. But now, notice the crescendo in verse 33. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. Now this is talking about Pilate, the governor, the Gentile governor of Judea, who had the power to crucify Jesus, to send him to the cross. He goes on to say in verse 34, they will mock him and scourge him. This is the Roman scourge. And this was part of the whole crucifixion ordeal, where they would first beat the victim with a scourge in order to hasten his death at crucifixion. And so Jesus is ramped up the prediction now to show it is one of the worst possible ends to a life. Now, he has talked about taking up crosses, but this is the first time he's been so explicit in saying that he is going to be mocked and scourged and spit upon and murdered. And so it's very, very strong. It's a crescendo of sorts that Mark is bringing to the table. Secondly, the crescendo is seen in that Jesus predicts that the disciples, his apostles, will finally get it. They will finally understand and arrive. Now, this is found in chapter 10, verses 35 and following, where, as we already saw, James and John are asking for the most prominent positions in the kingdom. But verse 38, Jesus says, you do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? Here Jesus is clearly talking about his inundation in suffering, his total immersion in the suffering for the sins of the world. To drink a cup of the wrath of God is to have God's wrath poured out on you. That's the concept. On Thursday mornings, we're studying out of the book of Revelation, and in chapter 16, we read about the bowls of God's wrath being poured out on the world. And so that's the imagery here, to drink the cup of the wine of the wrath of God. You see that in the Old Testament in various places. Well, Jesus has to drink that cup. As he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. It's drinking the cup of suffering. And then he talks about the idea of baptism, to be baptized with the baptism of suffering. And so he's saying, in order for you to be placed in the kingdom, in the correct place, it will depend on your willingness to undergo suffering for the cause of Christ and for the cause of Christianity. And that's what he's saying to them. Well, they say in verse 41, in verse 39, we're able to do that. Clearly, they still don't get it. They don't understand. But Jesus makes this prediction. This is the first time he has made this kind of prediction. In verse 39, he says, Jesus says to them, you will indeed drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. So he's grooming these men, he's chosen them, and he's going to bring them, at least 11 of them that we know of, without Judas, but he's going to bring them to their fruition, and they will eventually get it. But at the time here, they just don't get it. In fact, as it says in verse 41, when the 10 heard it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John. So they are still fighting among one another about who would be the greatest and most prominent and popular in the kingdom. And Jesus has to explain to them, you don't understand that those who are considered rulers in the world think that way, but my kingdom is not that way. Verse 43, it shall not be so among you. Whoever desires to become great shall be servant of all. Whoever desires to be first will be slave of all. So there is that crescendo there. They don't get it yet, but they will. And we have many of the writings in the New Testament by some of these men. And they understand what it means now to be a true disciple of Jesus. But they didn't get it at the time. And thirdly, Mark shows a crescendo here in Jesus' prediction that his death now is going to accomplish a ransom for the sins of his people. Verse 45, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So this is the first time in the book of Mark that you have an explicit declaration about the atonement and about what it means for Jesus to go to the cross. Not only is he just being rejected by the leaders of Israel because they disagree with his doctrine or the fact that he exposes their sins and so forth, but there's actually a plan behind all of this, and that God is accomplishing a ransom, a redemption of people. And that's what is predicted here. So in all of these ways, Mark has reached a climax in the drama of this particular section. And we read here that Jesus' death will be the buying back of the slaves of sin. And that's the idea of this ransom terminology. Now, many other writers in the New Testament use this motif of ransom. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 and 18 says, you were not redeemed with corruptible things like gold and silver received from the vain tradition of your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without spot, who was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last days for you. So Peter is talking about redemption there. Paul uses it in Ephesians 1, verse 7. In him we are having redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. He also says in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20, you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. There is that ransom terminology. The Hebrews writer talks about redeeming the sins that were committed under the old covenant. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15. So Jesus ransoms the sins even under the old economy. And John in Revelation 5 and verse 9 talks about the worship going to the Lamb there in the midst of the throne, because you have redeemed us to God by your blood of all nations, languages, and tribes and so forth. So this is a very pervasive motif in the New Testament about the atonement work of Jesus as a ransom for many. And it came because Jesus did not come with this attitude of his disciples where he wants to be served, but rather he came to serve and to give his life in order to accomplish that ransom. And so we've reached this part of the teaching of the disciples on the importance of being a servant. Are you a servant? What are your expectations of being a disciple of Jesus? Are you looking for popularity and prestige and comfort, preeminence? Or do you realize that what it is a calling to service and sacrifice? Because that is the whole issue of Christianity, is service in this world, and let God do the exalting at the proper time according to his own will. And that's what we're learning here. And finally, we move to the crescendo of the entire section in the healing of a blind man named Bartimaeus. Now, in verse 46, it says, now they came to Jericho, and he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, and blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. Now, when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. So here is a blind man who hears that Jesus and his followers are coming down the road. And he sees something about Jesus that evidently not too many others did see. Now, the question that Jesus asks him, as it says in verse 51, Jesus answered and said to him, what do you want me to do for you? It's important for us to see that this question is what ties it to the section before. Because in the section before, in chapter 10, verses 35 and 36, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do something for us." And he says to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the two answers to that question are so different. And that, of course, forms the contrast that Mark is trying to make between a blind man who understands his own blindness and his own disciples who are blind but yet don't see it, who don't understand their own blindness. Because James and John ask, "We want you to grant us power and position and exaltation in your kingdom so that we can rule over other people." And blind Bartimaeus asks for true sight. He wants to be healed by Jesus so he can see clearly. That's what the disciples should have been asking. Help us not only to get the words right that you are the Christ, but help us to understand what it truly means for you to be the Christ so that we can follow you correctly. And so that is the contrast that's said here. Now I have 4 points and the lesson is yours. Number 1, the blind man sees Jesus more clearly than the disciples see Jesus with 2 good eyes. The blind man sees Jesus more clearly than the disciples who had good eyesight. And that is the basic contrast that Mark is bringing out. As one commentator said, what the man lacked with eyesight, he made up for in insight. He knew more correctly about Jesus, even though he didn't know perfectly. Number 2, the blind man still has deficient understanding of Jesus, but he admits it. He's coming to Jesus, humbling himself and asking that he might receive his sight in verse 51. He knows that he's blind, and he knows that Jesus is the only one that can help him. And that leads to number 3, that the blind man humbles himself and exercises his faith in Jesus. That is what true discipleship is. It's not exalting yourself over others, but it's humbling yourself before Jesus and exercising faith in Him and trusting Him to heal you. And so what you see in the blind man here is this humility and faith, while the 12, the last time you see them, they're still bickering among one another about who would be the greatest in chapter 10, verse 41. And finally, number 4, the blind man finally shows, Mark shows the blind man following Jesus on the road. Verse 52, Jesus says to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. Those are both very important ideas and phrases that have been used earlier in this section. If you'll remember, of course, back in chapter 8, you have verse 27, part of the main thesis here. It says, Jesus and his disciples went out of the towns of Caesarea Philippi and on the road. This will be a little phrase that you'll see, on the road. And down in verse 34, where he begins to teach them about what it means to be Christ and for them to follow him, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Follow me on the road. That's the idea. On the road where? To Jerusalem, where I will be betrayed and where I will be killed. Several times, back in chapter 10, verse 17, as Jesus was going on the road, one came kneeling before him and asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" We looked at that last week. And Jesus says in verse 21 at the end of the verse, "Take up your cross and follow me." Verse 32, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Jesus was going before them and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. So those are the phrases that you're seeing, and by the end of this section in 10:52 it says, immediately the blind man received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. So the blind man went from the side of the road, an outcast, one that the crowd was telling him to be quiet, to following Jesus now on the road because of his humility and his faith. Now the disciples were following Jesus in a sense, but as they followed, they were afraid. The disciples were following Jesus with fear, with confusion, but this man was following Jesus in faith. And that reaches the end of that particular section. We begin a new section now with chapter 11, verse 1, where it says they drew near Jerusalem. So they finally made it to their destination. And Mark will then go into a new literary unit where he shows Jesus now entering the city and the betrayal, the arrest, the crucifixion ordeal, and of course ending in the resurrection. But that is the section of Mark 8, 9, and 10, and showing Mark's genius literary format here in trying to make the point. And we ask ourselves, ultimately in application, what does it mean to you for Jesus to be the Christ? And if you're a disciple, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What do you think it means? Because Jesus is teaching us here that it means we have to learn to humble ourselves before Him and before other people. If we want to be great in the kingdom, we have to learn how to serve other people. We put others before ourselves. That is the teaching of this particular section and the powerful way that Mark brings this out. So we will conclude our Bible study there, and that way next Wednesday, Lord willing, we will pick up in chapter 11 and go forward from there. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there. I see there's a handful of brothers and sisters, looks like all sisters tonight, tuning in for the live stream. But it will be available for the rest, and I know we had a good crowd ready to listen to the class earlier. Didn't make it, but nonetheless, it'll be available. So I appreciate it. I'll lead us in a word of prayer, and then I will sign out of the feed. So let's pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we're thankful for the time to come together and open your word. Thank you for the message of Mark and for these chapters where Jesus is teaching us what it means to follow Him. Help us to take up our cross, to realize that this world will not always be easy, that we will face adversity, and that we will suffer for the cause of Christ, and yet we can be of good cheer because Jesus has indeed overcome the world, and we have faith in Him. Thank you so much for the church. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be brothers and sisters. And we pray that you would help us to serve one another. Thank you so much for Jesus' great example that He came not to be served but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many. We love you and we thank you for first loving us and showing that in the cross of Jesus Christ and His victorious resurrection and victory. We pray all in His name.